Hey everyone, and welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, talk about the art and the science of the things we put on our feet. Today, we are very, very lucky to have an esteemed guest, someone that we've known for quite some time and who we have a great amount of respect for, and also occasionally get to see him either in person or go back and forth online. I've got Cory Hofmann on the line. And so Cory is a very important person at Saucony, and we go back and forth talking all the time. And I'll let Cory introduce himself in a second. But the purpose of this episode is Cory and I are going to have a little debate talking about super shoes. Because Cory, if you don't know this, has a really awesome Substack out there where he talks about some of the biomechanics behind what's going on, addresses some of the research stuff that's going out there. And if you don't subscribe and read it, you definitely should. But one of the articles, Cory, that you wrote was about super shoes and injuries. And so we are going to get into that and debate that a little bit, and we'll go from there. But first, would you mind, for the people that are new, would you mind introducing yourself and letting them know your the pedigree behind your name?
Well, thank you. Always great to be on the show. Love the podcast. I listen to it while I'm running along with Charles. Every Wednesday, so it's an honor to be back on. So my name is Cory Hofmann. For those of you who haven't listened to me on past episodes, I'm a senior performance engineer at Saucony. What does that mean? Well, it means I basically oversee all fit testing, wear testing, mechanical testing for both components and whole shoe, physiological testing, and also biomechanical testing for all product in our portfolio. So I stay busy. It's a lot of fun, and also can contribute to our sister brand in our portfolio, Merrill, as well. So really excited to be here, and really excited to potentially debate. I'm sure we're in closer alignment. I've listened to you a lot over the years, Matt. So I've listened to you a lot more than you've listened to me, but I think we're probably going to be a lot closer in alignment than you might think.
I would agree, but as usual, I'm going to try to cause some debate and problems, as I usually do, just to keep things interesting. So, Cory, I've had the great fortune of both meeting Cory in person several times and him actually testing me in the lab. And you know what? I'm going to tell you this. I'm still jealous of that massive Woodway treadmill that you guys have in there and all the cool stuff you got. It's absolutely awesome. What a fun place to go to work. So
I have a lot of toys. That's great.
Yes, they have a lot of toys. There's a lot of things that we saw. We went there previously that we couldn't talk about as usual. It was like, instead of just David being the one that's saying I can't talk about it, it was all of us not being able to talk about it. Right. But it's really fun to know a group and know an individual that really not only like works on this stuff, but also geeks out on it just as much. And also is asking similar questions and trying the best to answer them with often the limited evidence that we have. So speaking of which, Cory, would you do a quick synopsis of the article that you wrote?
Yeah, of course. I have to apologize. I don't think it'll be quick, but
that's fine. I don't know why I said quick. There's a lot to talk about here. So it'll be a summary, or basically just talk about the whole thing, really.
Of course. Yeah. So as Matt mentioned, I started a Substack earlier this year, just an opportunity to write on topics I find interesting. Of course, given my background and my day job, I think about running a lot. I think about footwear a lot, and this sort of topic has been coming up certainly more frequently in the past handful of years. The idea of injury risk, training, running, racing in super shoes. So it became a topic that I thought would be interesting to write about. So I certainly had some preconceived notions and some opinions. So I started diving a little bit deeper, and doing some research. Digging up articles I hadn't read in the past or I hadn't previously read until now. So it kind of came up with this thesis. Wrote this article. It was my first launch on my Substack. I think I got a pretty good response. A lot of people said, no, you're an idiot, or no, I totally, yes, I agree. Thank you for writing this. And I've gotten a lot of good feedback from it. So yeah, I thought it would be relevant and timely, certainly given, my day job and the proliferation of super shoes in the market. So Basically, it's conversations I've had with colleagues, with distinguished podcasters like Matt here, and it's the idea of super shoes. They've been around a while now. Almost every brand has a handful of them, but is there any potential risk associated with running in them? Period. And then is there any risk associated with running in them frequently, and then perhaps maybe even running in them every single day? So I think that was kind of the genesis behind it. So I guess we can kind of dive in. I'm going to walk through kind of my thought process, the research that I read, and kind of what led me down that path. And then Matt, feel free to just dive in and let me know if you agree, disagree, if you love that paper, you hate that paper, and we'll just kind of go from there. So does that sound good?
That sounds good to me.
Yeah. So I think the article that's brought up the most when I'm having this discussion or debate or conversation with colleagues is a paper by Adam 1040. I hope I'm saying that name right. From 2023, I believe. It was recent. Mm-hmm. And the article was something to the effect of bone stress injuries in what they called carbon fiber plated footwear. And what their objective was to highlight a series of 5 case studies that involved a specific injury for runners when specifically wearing a super shoe or an advanced footwear technology. And the particular injury was a navicular stress fracture, which is not a good one. I've never had that injury. I'm very thankful for that. Matt, I'm hoping you haven't either. It's a bad one. So they essentially said, let's take a closer look at this particular injury, and we just wanted to talk about these 5 athletes and describe kind of their backgrounds and who they are and what happened to them specifically that led to the injury. And what's and their justification or their the impetus behind the article was, well, we know from the past 6-7 years of research that the biomechanics of the foot and the ankle are altered when wearing super shoes compared to traditional footwear. So if it is altered, then potentially the stresses applied to the body are different. And if those stresses are applied differently, then there's potential for an injury mechanism here. So totally fair, totally reasonable. And so if you read the article and you take a closer look at the 5 individuals who were injured, Matt, you're smiling. I'm guessing you know this article well.
Yes, I do know this article well, and I have. It says interesting things, but there are some reservations that obviously should be held when you're only looking at 5. So basically, what's called a case series, where this is not a randomized controls trial. It's not even really an observational study. It's just it kind of is, but you just picked these 5 individual cases. And the challenge with this is that it's not controlled, right? You never know who you're getting or why. And I'll let you keep going, but just this is a good starting place, but it's not the end. And that's what's important to pay attention to early.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, it's basically a case study, and 5 of them rolled into one. Yep. And so what they found was, of the 5 athletes who had developed a navicular stress fracture while wearing carbon-plated footwear, 3 of the 5 athletes were current or former steeplechasers. Now, I've never run the steeple, but it looks like it's a pretty tough event. Certainly, the stresses associated with that are pretty different from just flat over ground running. 2 of the 5, with some overlap, had a past navicular stress fracture, and then that popped up again, or it reoccurred when that athlete introduced carbon-plated footwear for the first time. Yeah.
And for the listeners, from a clinical perspective, regardless of what you're wearing, the greatest risk for a stress fracture in an area is a previous history of a stress fracture in that area. And that doesn't matter if it's the navicular, a metatarsal, the distal, the tibia, femur, sacrum. I have seen a surprising number of sacral stress fractures recently, and they frequently reoccur. And we're not sure, by the way, if there's a biomechanical influence, if it's multifactorial. Just when they happen in one area, they tend to reoccur because when you have any kind of fracture, be it stress fracture or full like break, the bone doesn't fully ever heal, right? You get healing, it stabilizes, but like any type of injury, there's still a echo is probably the best term I've ever heard from this from a radiologist friend that I was talking to. He goes, there's always a little echo there. There's always a shadow that of what was there previously, meaning it's healed, but it's not going to be exactly the same, which is why if, care is not taken, there's definitely a risk for it to reoccur in the same area. And a lot of people, unfortunately, will know if you've had one stress fracture, you'll generally know whether the second one is or is not the same thing. 90+%, this is not evidence-based, this is testimonial of patients that I've worked with have gone, yeah, it kind of feels the same. You're like, oh, gosh. But yeah, sorry.
I might even go one step additional and say that almost any injury, the highest risk factor is having had that same injury in the past. I think that would extend beyond
absolutely
bone stress injuries. One of the five, again with some overlap, one of the five was an athlete that normally wears orthotics, took out the orthotic, and then ran in a super shoe for, I think it said the second or the third time. And it was a 22-mile training run deep into a marathon training block, which, that's going to be a very, very high stress kind of introduction of a brand new training stimulus in multiple different ways. So I think almost all five of those, I'm reading this and I'm trying to look at it with a critical eye, and I'm thinking there might be a lot of explanations here beyond just the introduction of what they call a carbon fiber plated shoe. So that's kind of what I thought about that. Sorry, do you want to say something about it?
Yeah. Do you think it's a good time to help define? Because a lot of times, and we'd have to clarify, because during that time, but some of the evidence that was taken, there were still a decent number of shoes out there that had a carbon fiber plate, but maybe not a super foam. So is it a good time to define? I'm curious to know how you define advanced footwear technology. So a lot of the commercial, or what most consumers are going to know, is something called a super shoe. And oftentimes, and Cory threw me for a loop before we were talking beforehand, and now my categorization of these shoes has totally been thrown. So I will try to go back to this, but know that I'm thinking out loud as I say this going, is this, so thank you, Cory. This is why we love you. Because you challenge me all the time, which is great.
Yeah.
So super racing shoes are generally thought of as these lighter weight shoes meant for running fast. That's how they're usually designed, to my understanding. You can correct me on that. That my understanding that they're designed based on faster running mechanics, and they're meant to improve running economy, race performance, all these different things. And they generally have three components that are pretty important. The first is some kind of what's called the super foam, and there's a variety of things out there, be it PIBA-based foams, ATP, all these kind of things that are super resilient, very bouncy foams meant to improve running economy. There's some kind of stiffening agent. Carbon fiber is what most people will talk about, although there's actually many variations of this that still can apply. And then obviously you've got geometry that works with all three of these to facilitate forward motion, on top of probably four things is a much lighter weight, although you'll see weight vary all over the place with this. That compares to something we were talking about beforehand called a super trainer, which is a shoe that also can have these components, but is meant to run fast, but also be used for slower efforts, be it daily training, whatever kind of stuff. And there's supposed to be this split category. And then above all this is advanced footwear technology. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say this yet, so this part may get cut, but I don't know him directly. I met him at CSM, but JJ Hannigan is a professor at Oregon State University in their PT department who's been doing a lot of great research on this, and recently sent out a survey trying to understand and define this better. And JJ, if you're listening to this, I apologize. I don't know if you published this. I look for it every once in a while, so call me out. I don't think it's out yet. So Cory, because he was trying to help to get experts to define what this is, but how do you define advanced footwear technology?
Yeah, I think your description is spot on, and I defined it in the article. With maybe one important additional comment is I think the intended use of the product,
Mhm.
it becomes important. Where advanced footwear technology is sort of this catch-all term for, you know, it's literally just advanced in technology with so anything that has advanced over the years could be considered advanced footwear technology. So
And
yeah, you're right.
that needle's going to move too as we keep going forward.
Of course, yeah. So I would say almost always there's some sort of super foam, right? Like you already mentioned, which means pretty soft and compliant, responsive, and lightweight, right? So and some sort of stiffening agent and some sort of geometry that facilitates forward motion. I think those are the kind of key attributes there, but there's quite a bit of variability, and I think that's probably one of the bigger arguments against the claim that super shoes cause injuries is which super shoe are we talking about? Are we talking about a 32 millimeter stack height in the heel with 32 millimeter stack height in the forefoot with a nylon or a plastic stiffening agent? Are we talking about a shoe with a substantially softer foam that's 40 millimeters in the heel and 32 in the forefoot? Are we talking about a 50 plus millimeter stack height shoe with again, not a carbon fiber plate, not a plastic plate, some other stiffening agent? So all of these design elements we know conclusively, longitudinal bending stiffness, compliance, responsiveness, they all have an influence on how you run and the biomechanics of running. So it's very difficult to say as a blanket statement, super shoes cause or do not cause injuries when all of these design elements can vary and still fall under the umbrella of super shoe or even super trainer.
And then we have the other issue is that how people respond to them is also totally different. And you mentioned this, where there are responders and people that have very exaggerated biomechanical and physiological responses where they are super responders and they like get massive economy improvements. And then you have other people that either don't respond to them at all and their mechanics don't change. I mean, they change a little bit often, but not much. And you have the other people that actually do far worse, that they really struggle in these shoes. They have, altered running economy that may or may not improve. Sometimes it can be worse. And so understanding, like when we say, hey, this increases injuries, the question is who, because we know all these different components and it's not consistent between companies and shoes. How do we know exactly what component with each person? So it gets much more muddy there. But anyway.
Even if you take the same person in the same shoe and have them run 5 minute per mile versus 10 minute per mile, their biomechanics will vary very drastically.
Yep.
So even within a single person, it becomes very difficult to draw broad sweeping conclusions. So yeah. So anyway, moving on through the article. So the idea becomes, well, why navicular stress fracture? And I think it's a valid question. So is there some sort of mechanism behind this injury that could be tied back to something involving footwear? Because the navicular is a bone in the foot. So is there a linkage here? So that leads us to this really interesting article from 2018. Sorry, it's in the article, so feel free to pull it up while you're. Hopefully you're not listening to this while you're driving, and pull up the article and take a peek. But
there will be a quiz at the end, by the way, so you should be taking notes. I'm just kidding.
So this article was out of Oregon. It was Becker was the first author, and what this is just a brilliant paper. I love it. And what they did is they studied two groups of runners, and this doesn't quite predate super shoes, but it definitely is, very, very early in the age of super shoes. There are no super shoes in this study. I was just looking at a group of runners. One group had suffered a navicular stress fracture in their life, and the other group had not. And they matched the two groups based on like age, I think it was total running mileage, and I think also foot strike type. So they had pretty good controls. And what's also very interesting is what makes this study cool is that each injured runner also serves as their own control because they have an affected limb and an unaffected limb. So now what you can do is compare within an injured person, but then also across the injured group to the never injured group, which is what makes this really, really fascinating. And what they wanted to do was determine, is there any fundamental differences in the biomechanics of these runners, whether it be injured to uninjured or within the injured runner from their healthy foot to the affected foot. And what they found were there were some small but statistically significant differences from the foot that had the history of injury to the healthy foot, and then also from the foot that had a history of injury to the healthy control group. And what the primary difference was that the injured foot went through about 5 degrees more of rear foot eversion. So that is a big component of pronation. So interesting, right? And why does that matter? Like, why is pronating more a potential injury mechanism? Well, the tibialis posterior inserts directly onto the navicular, right? I know Matt knows this, and I know the chunk of the audience that's PTs and DPTs are all kind of nodding, and yeah, of course, it inserts right on that bone. So if there is more range of motion, potentially this muscle is pulling harder on this bone, putting more stress on that bone, which potentially could be an injury mechanism for particularly stress fracture risk at the navicular. However, what the authors can't necessarily determine is, was this injury the cause of or the result of the navicular stress fracture? In other words, did getting that injury cause you to change how your foot moves following the recovery from that injury? Now, the navicular is a stress fracture there is often surgically repaired. So that surgery and that pretty comprehensive rehabilitation to get back to running, that can potentially result in differences in how that foot moves. So while very interesting and certainly statistically significant, we can't necessarily say whether that foot moved differently prior to the first navicular stress fracture that injured cohort received.
One of the challenges too, and we know this from some prior evidence, is actually people that pronate typically have a lower rate of stress fractures compared to those who don't as much, because pronation is actually a method of fairly efficient shock absorption as long as you have good control. And the injuries usually associated with pronation tend to be pretty different compared to those who do not. And this is only describing one normal movement of the foot and ankle. Okay. There's lots of other parts, and this is triplanar, multiple joints going on, that the foot and ankle is a complex area. So just trying to dumb this down to one joint and one motion is not a good idea. But we do know that people who don't tend to pronate as much actually tend to have a higher risk of stress fracture type injuries. So that would go, hey, wait a minute, this is going a little bit opposite to what we might think. And then the research on soft shoes versus firm shoes is also not very good on this area as well. So it's interesting to me. But yeah.
So that brings us, a little bit closer to today, in the research world, and a researcher that you've already brought up, JJ Hannigan, who I've never met, but loved reading his paper. So that was great. But yeah, so it was a specific study looking at, we've seen the articles that are suggesting that, this is a potential injury that could be of interest for, the super shoe, athlete, the athlete using the super shoe. And we've seen that there's a potential injury mechanism here, increased rear foot eversion. So let's take a cohort of athletes and have them run, in a non-super shoe and in a super shoe, and then look at the differences in their biomechanics. Very, very nicely controlled experimental design. Interestingly, reading through this, they must have had some pretty exceptional athletes in this cohort. Matt, you're smiling. I'm guessing you know something about the experiment, but
yeah, well, I mean, they're doing it in Bend, Oregon, so of course they're gonna have some great people, fast people up there. Yeah.
But hey, it's
no judgment.
They specifically tested everyone so they could have the athletes running at marathon pace, which ended up being somewhere around like a 2:30 marathon was the average athlete in the experiment. So these are pretty finely tuned athletic machines, shall we say.
This sounds like this is the average person walking around downtown Bend, Oregon. So
that
tracks.
Been, so
I have actually not been either, but from what I hear about, despite living in Oregon, but from what I'm hearing about it, this tracks. It makes sense.
Yeah. So I believe their control shoe was the New Balance Minimus, which is a pretty different shoe than a super shoe. It's not even like a default standard daily trainer, but this is a pretty extreme delta from the next percent, which was the super shoe they used in this study. And what they found was that the athletes in the next percent, so the super shoe from Nike, the athletes went through a larger range of motion at the rear foot in eversion inversion, which interesting. Again, kind of weaving a consistent tale here, but the athletes didn't evert more. They were more inverted on initial contact. So they went through a larger range of motion, but they didn't go through more eversion or more, you could think of it as pronation. So that's interesting. And what they also found was that there wasn't greater joint torque here, which probably suggests pretty strongly, not definitively, but pretty strongly, that there wasn't excess load at the tibialis posterior tendon. So what does that mean? The next percent shoe absolutely elicits a different foot motion than the New Balance Minimus. That would be my hypothesis that would happen. Those are pretty different shoes, but that it seems unlikely that this would cause greater stresses at the navicular. That's my kind of interpretation of the results from there. I don't think there's nothing here. I think it's an interesting topic. There's a lot of research. There are a lot of studies suggesting, hey, this could be an area of interest. So that's where I think it's good to kind of pause it before I go too deep down the rabbit hole, and maybe Matt, you want to bring up some comments before I draw my final conclusion. Perhaps.
That's okay. So there's a couple things here, and some of the things that we need to know is like torque is one thing. We also know that when it comes to pronation, it's not the total amount that is usually the problem, but the actual velocity of which it happens. And again, this research is not in the bone. It's really looking at the tendon of the post tib itself, that like, cause tendons and muscles tend to be very sensitive to fast motion. So that's called a fast eccentric motion, i.e. the muscle is being lengthened very quickly, is the greatest stresses that you can put through this area. That's where plyometrics are such a potent training tool. If you used appropriately, they can either injure you if you do them poorly, or they can build a lot of resiliency if done correctly, because they really condition the muscle tendons used to handle really, really good stresses and forces because they're so intense. So which is why velocity tends to make a much bigger impact and something that we really pay attention to a lot more than how much. Because if somebody pronates and they go into and out of it, we found that if you can control it, regardless of the amount, and you get back out of it, you're fine. But if it's excessively fast and nobody's actually defined how fast or what that means, that may be an issue, but we don't know a lot about, hey, how does that then translate to pulling on a bone, knowing that bones can also adapt and knowing that each person that runs is going to have totally different like amounts of, what am I trying to say? Like I'm getting lost here for a second because I've got so many things going through my head, but each person's going to have a different amount. Each person's going to have different stresses. How do you control? You need to control for a group that probably had a history of pronation related injuries, knowing they've had trouble controlling that, and compare that to a group that's healthy, which really hasn't been done. And then you'd probably have to you'd need to follow them over a while and see, hey, which group actually has a navicular stress injury, if they even show up. And I will tell you, from following the George Fox team for the cross country and track teams for over a year, none of them really get that injured. And so it's like, sometimes you have nothing that you can walk away with because they don't get injured and that doesn't tell you anything. So this research is really hard to do, but it's also a warning story of why you have to be really careful drawing definite conclusions, because there's probably some subgroups in there that maybe the answer is yes, but we don't know how to identify those yet. However, I'm still going to challenge Cory in just a second. So
great.
Let's land this and then we'll take off in another plane and see how this goes.
Yeah. So approaching the runway here.
Yeah.
So let's say everything we've discussed, caveats and all, we'll take at face value.
Yeah.
Let's say that all super shoes elicit a very similar response. We know that's not true, but let's say they're all somewhat compliant. They all result in a similar effect to an athlete. And let's assume that effect results in greater stresses, more load in the tibialis posterior tendon, and greater stresses on the navicular bone. Let's take all of that and just say yes. For enough people, that is meaningfully true. Even if that is the case, more stress on an area of the body does not mean that area will be injured. And this goes back to like day 1, hour 1, minute 1 of any exercise science, kinesiology, biology class that, biomechanics class that any of us have ever taken, if you have. And it's specific adaptation to oppose demand. And that demand is related to the frequency, intensity, time, and type, right? Everyone has probably heard this at some point. So any tissue of the body can potentially suffer an overuse injury if you've subjected it to too much stress with insufficient recovery. So the alternative to that is you apply stress to it, but you provide sufficient recovery, whereas now that tissue now has the opportunity to recover and become more robust, more resilient to additional stressors. So in my opinion, and I think this applies to most, in my opinion, overuse injuries, whereby if you apply too much stress to one area of the body with insufficient recovery, you are way more likely to become injured. So that could be true with the navicular, it could be the Achilles tendon, it could be the plantar fascia, the patellofemoral joint. All of these areas are potentially at risk. So that's why I came up finally after I wrote the paper with the title of the paper, where, in my opinion, super shoes don't cause injuries. Running, I wanted to say running causes injuries, because running causes injuries. Running applies stresses to the body. Shoes can potentially modify that stress. And in some ways, you might be moving stress from an area of the body that was on the brink of an injury, and you've shifted stress away from that area of the body, and now you are less likely to become injured. Or it could be the exact opposite. Now you've introduced any intervention to the body whereby it is shifting stresses from one area to a less robust area, and now you're at significantly higher risk. That could be the navicular, it could be any other area in the lower extremity. So in my opinion, I think we need to be more careful. And I think all of this research is very important, understanding what design elements of a super shoe result in what changes to one's biomechanics, which result in what changes to the stress profile. But then it's on the coaches, the athletes, the PTs, the DPTs, the healthcare practitioners to understand how to modify and manipulate the stress profile to allow an athlete to recover or to become more robust and resilient to injuries in the future.
Returning from running-related injuries can sometimes take a very intentional and sequential return to adding that stress back onto your body. And so it can be helpful to have some sort of system that can offload some of your body weight in order to decrease the stress on whatever tissue is recovering. As a physical therapist and personally, I have utilized the lever system to help with return to running after running-related injuries. And what's great about this system is it is completely portable, and so it can be put and connected to pretty much any treadmill within your home or at your local gym. And it's also extremely affordable. Unlike some offloading systems, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars, you get this at a significant fraction of that cost. And so if you're looking at finding a solution to help you return to running in a really smart way, go check out the Lever Movement System at levermovement.com, and you can use the code DOR20 to get 20% off your purchase.
So I totally agree with you on this. And one of the major reasons why I wanted to get you on here to talk about this is that, and I say this as someone studying biomechanics and getting extremely frustrated that, the master's running research I have done, I found no difference in running biomechanics between the master's runners that had Achilles tendinopathy and the ones that didn't. It wasn't until I actually had them do non-running related activities that I actually started to see some differences. And then I got questioned on this, which is where I've been for the last year, going, hey, you use this non-running related activity. How do you know that's related to running at all? And I went, oh, I have to go study that for a little bit. They still published the paper, thank goodness.
Great.
I came up with some excuse going, this is the general standard for sport testing. Give me a break. I'm just trying to get this published. And somehow they took that. But biomechanics doesn't tell the full story. And for anybody that's followed biomechanics research for a while, you will know this, that a lot of times they'll go, we have all these biomechanical things. One study will say, hey, this might be related. Another might not. And running injuries are multifactorial. And Cory mentioned this. Running has a really high injury risk. Depending on what study you read, that can be anywhere from 40% to 80% of runners.
Yeah.
If I've even seen one that said like 90%, and they vary all over the place depending on population, but it's a fairly high injury. And that's because running, there's a lot of impact. Once you get comfortable with it, it's fairly easy to overtrain. And I will tell you that from personal experience. And it's hard to know, because a lot of people that run, it's hard to know when to back off, what recovery looks like. It's hard to balance this with getting adequate sleep, getting adequate nutrition, getting all that right at the same time. This stuff happens because you also have stress in daily life, and injuries are multifactorial. And all the research trying to define running related injuries has come to the same conclusion, that running related injuries are multifactorial things, and there's not one single component. Are there things that are actually really high risk factors? Yeah. Inadequate nutrition, not sleeping, overtraining actually sometimes in some literature is, and sometimes actually having a high running volume can actually be protective. But if you take that running volume and suddenly jump it up quicker than your body can adapt to, then yes, there's a paper that just came out, and I'm forgetting the author's name, that they suggested one of the biggest risks for running related injury was a single sudden intense increase in either volume or intensity. And it's yeah, that makes sense. You overexceeded your body's capacity to adapt to that. It's far beyond. And now instead of getting this nice, you did some tissue damage and now you get this super compensation effect where your body gets better. You're so far down in the red that your recovery period, you're still in the red, and then you went to go train harder. And then, so injuries are multifactorial. And I say this as someone, again, who's doing biomechanics. It's really hard to pinpoint this stuff. And that's why you have to take it with a grain of salt. So and I'm sure you see the same thing going, when you test biomechanics of shoes, as you mentioned, each individual is totally different. Their response is different. The response even within individuals is different at different speeds. And I would bet even sometimes on different days or weeks or months, it just varies. And you're like, what?
How fatigued were you when you entered the lab?
That's great. Awesome. It's for those people that are non-scientists, just know how hard it is to do good science and how frustrating it can be sometimes to go, I'm just trying to get somewhat of an answer. Can you just throw me give me a break here. But so anything else you want to say on your, on this before I take this in a slightly different direction?
Yeah, no, I think, just to reiterate, frequency, intensity, time, and type, specific adaptation to opposed demand. Yeah, those two kind of core fundamental principles can teach and inform a lot of research. So I think biomechanics research is extremely important. I do it because it helps you understand what those stresses are. But then it's on a large group of individuals to make sure that those stresses are applied. I'll say quote unquote correctly, in the right dose, with sufficient recovery, and those other 23 hours of the day are important too. I think for that reason, injury research will continue to live on because we will never come to the final conclusion.
No, that the biomechanics research gods have made sure of that for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take this a slightly different route. So I'm going to try to challenge you on this, even though I completely agree with you. So
it's not a fun debate if you agree.
Exactly. It's boring. It's like, all right, we're done it. All right, bye everybody. No. Yeah. So one of the things that we know about these shoes, and this has been well documented, is they really decrease delayed onset muscle soreness. They improve running economy. And some people, they actually decrease fatigue. So people are able to get a much higher training volume and much more intense efforts in these types of shoes than they had previously. And we're seeing that consistently, not just in the evidence, but testimonially. There's a lot of athletes going, I can hit much higher volumes. I can hit harder workouts than before. Is that necessarily a good thing? We haven't really concluded that either, because we know that, again, specific adaptations to specific imposed demands, we know that some of those adaptations are good. And so maybe there's a time and place to use these tools to decrease fatigue and go farther. There may also be a place, as Justin Matties was looking at, who did some great stuff in his master's research, looking at, hey, when you use super shoes, there can be in certain tissues a little bit less adaptation, like, again, elasticity, some kind of muscle factors compared to more traditional shoes, which makes sense. If it's making you more economical, there's going to be a trade-off somewhere. Now, my challenge is, and I'm going to agree with you, but I'm also going to put an asterisk sign. Do you think that these shoes increase the risk for people to overtrain? So I'm not saying, and I agree with you, I'm not saying the shoes are the problem or the tools are the problems, but the tools in the hands of people that don't know how to use them. Is there a risk that that it allows them to extend beyond where they possibly can? And I'm going to give some background to this. One of the things that I've been toying with, and somebody can take this because I haven't figured out how to really look at this and actually research this yet. Mostly because, again, I have a group of runners near me that never get stress fractures, so I don't have anybody to study, and I don't really want that to change, honestly. Preferably, because they're really tough to rehab from, and they take a long time, and it's one of those things where people want specific timelines of when they can start running. And it's like, you can't start even doing jumps and stuff until you have 0 symptoms, and that's a non-argument. You can't be running with a 2 or 3 out of 10 because it just, all the literature has been, it has to be 0. It's one of the few places where we try not to make pain a big deal. That's one of the places we're going to make this a big deal because that's the only way to know this thing is calmed down. So these are not fun, but bone tends to heal a lot slower tends to adapt a lot slower than other tissues. Say even tendons are pretty slow, right? They take, my patients that have tendinopathy, I always warn them, hey, you want to make a real change in these tendons? It's going to take you 9 months of consistent loading to change the stuff. Bone can actually take even longer than that to make true adaptations to the tissue. And, we know that there might be some tendinous changes. That hasn't been studied with this footwear type. But we know that even though your muscles adapt really quick, it doesn't take that long, for 4 to 6 weeks max for them to usually recover, adapt, get stronger. It's really quick. They're pretty quick tissues. But is it possible that people won't feel that muscular fatigue and that they might take these super shoes and extend beyond where they're capable and not realize you actually don't have to have pain for a bone stress injury to start? And we've actually seen that, where we've seen, when I was at Cal State LA, when I was talking to people at USC down in Southern California, they do diagnostic ultrasounds on some of the cross country runners, and the runners be like, I don't have any pain. They'd be like, you have an active, old or current stress fracture in your foot. I'm I don't feel anything. So is there any possibility that these shoes allow us to overextend, potentially put certain people at risk?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is yes.
Mm-hmm.
My follow-up to that would be, is it the super shoe that's causing the injury, or is it the overuse? It still boils down to, in my opinion, of course, that it still becomes an overuse injury from the stresses of running.
Right.
So I think that's a 100% consideration. Probably not for the average runner. This is probably more skewed toward a more athletic, higher performance side of the population. But I 100% agree that in addition to these biomechanical changes, what these shoes can potentially allow you to do can potentially also put you at a higher risk. So
because there's the challenge of normally with like most traditional, especially like if you did the same thing you did like JJ Hannigan's study, if you tried to extend as far as you could that you did in a super shoe with a minimalist shoe, you would know it, right? You'd be like sore muscle, either muscle like strain or muscle soreness would probably stop you a lot. Or that's not the same for everybody, just because when the minimalist stuff came around, we saw a ton of metatarsal stress fractures show up there. So this might not be any different because people are still going to overtrain. So I already know Cory's going to checkmate me on this thing, and I already know how, but I'm going to still keep this argument up, by the way. But is it possible that it's harder to tell when you're overtraining because of the known decrease in muscle soreness and some other factors that we typically understand to be factors of like kind of like either a yellow or a red light with this stuff?
Yeah, it's a great comment. Yes, I agree. I do think that there is a very, very similar answer to your last question. Yes, I think that these technologies, these super shoes can potentially maybe reduce the RPE, the rating of perceived exertion, or the post workout perceived soreness. Certainly, we know that to be the case. So, yeah, I think absolutely that is a potential consideration and a potential risk. But I think that if the new intervention is carefully and methodically introduced into a training program, then I think what you do is significantly mitigate that risk. And it's funny that you bring up, the minimalism barefoot trend. I was in grad school during that trend, so it was a really fun time to be kind of a young budding biomechanics researcher. And spoiler, I'm almost certain a future article for my Substack is going to be foot strike type doesn't cause overuse injury, overuse does. Basically the exact same title, but replacing super shoe. And we have a decade plus more data in support of that.
I'm very upset that has still yet to die. And I still see every other post somebody's going, yeah, you have to use this foot strike and that's going to make you injury free. I'm like, that's not how this works. You're just, it's kind of, to be honest, the super shoes are like the geometry. And you mentioned this earlier is you're not getting rid of forces. Even if you feel less sore, you're just moving them other places, and that there's no such thing as a magic bullet. There's still going to be risks. And no matter what technology we come up with, I would bet money that our injury rates aren't going to change. Is that the shoe fault? No, it's us still we're human beings. We do dumb stuff. If you give us an inch, we're going to go take a mile. And you're like, oh, that's why. So yeah, I would agree that I think until we have a better understanding, the general public has a better understanding of like the stress strain relationship and like the stress recovery thing of how to actually get better. I agree that I think the injury rates are going to be still super high. You were saying,
it's just in that era, a lot of people were saying, you need to run barefoot. It's better. It will cure all your injuries. But it's very important that if you do that, you walk barefoot for 5 minutes day one, and then you take a recovery day, and then day two you walk barefoot for 10 minutes, and then you take a recovery day, and then day 5 you run for 1 minute and then walk for 2 minutes. And what you're doing is just you're very carefully, methodically increasing the stresses that are applied to the body. And then if you recover appropriately from those stresses, it will allow you to do more. You're basically reteaching your body to run from scratch. So yeah, of course, if you're very careful with how you apply stresses, you could probably build your way up to running a marathon on road barefoot.
Yeah, but did anybody do that though? Everybody just grabbed a pair of Vibram Five Fingers and went and ran the exact same mileage they were running previously. And so, because people don't make good decisions, they don't listen, they just go straight into stuff. And it's the same thing. I talked about, tendons taking that long to adapt. If there's some good evidence that suggests if you want to transition into minimal running, it's going to take you at least, if you want to do it safely, it takes you at least 6 to 9 months. And you cannot rush that or you risk injury. That's how it goes. Too fast, too soon, too much, too quick.
Yep. So I think, fill in the blank. Does anything cause overuse injuries? And I would say, well, it kind of depends on what you did.
Right.
The context is everything, not just the shoe that you're wearing.
Right. Do you think there are any factors that people could pay attention to? So again, because soreness may be mitigated by this and some of the more traditional factors that that most of us kind of know to go, oh, okay, I'm sore. This kind of aches a little bit. Now I need to back off. Since some of this might get mitigated, although there's still changes happening, are you think there's any other signs that people could pay attention to? Or is it just, hey, you just got to be smart and focus more on thinking about the stimulus than necessarily how exactly you feel?
Yeah. A lot of people in the running world might say, listen to your body, as something that's very important. But I know a lot of runners in my personal life who ignore that message from their body. So it's very difficult to say that. So I think a very careful, slow introduction of anything. If someone said, hey, should I throw on a weighted vest and start running 2 days a week in that weighted vest, which seems to be very popular right now, I would say, sure, if you want to do that, just very carefully and slowly, methodically introduce it to your training plan and make sure you adequately recover, and make sure everything's in the right context. So your body is amazing and fascinating, and it's resilient, and it can adapt to the stresses that you apply to it. It's what makes it more exciting than studying, say, a bridge. That's just, it's slowly degrading. Once it's done, it's on a slow kind of path of degradation, whereas your body can respond to and change its resilience.
Even though we're all slowly degrading anyway, but there's just some interesting changes that also happen along time. No, I'm just kidding.
Of course. Once you reach a certain age, it becomes harder. That becomes harder to win that battle, but
not impossible, ironically, as we're starting to realize. But it's interesting. So, yes. So some of the big takeaways is, again, the shoes themselves are not usually the things that are causing injuries. There may be some exceptions, that there may be certain individuals that we really have not been able to subgroup yet that may be more at risk for injury in certain shoes. We don't really know how to subgroup that. It's probably going, hey, you know what? If you see, and this is what we talk about here on Doctors Running, if there's something that shoe looks like it's going to emphasize and you tend to have trouble with that variable, that might be a warning sign to go, either that may not be the shoe for you, or you really need to slowly introduce this shoe in. That's why we get a lot of questions going, hey, I got X shoe. I've got a marathon in a few weeks. Should I transition into this? And often the answer is, I would not do that. I mean, if you really want to introduce a shoe into it for a racing tool, you can do it and you might get away with it, but you might not. It's probably better to make sure you have tested this thing multiple times over at least several weeks, or at least a major portion of your training block, to go, not only do you know if you can handle this, but also has your body adapted to the stress and stimulus associated with that training tool. So again, it comes down to us being smart and going, there's no shoe that will necessarily protect you from injury. And there's also not going to be any perfect one that potentially is going to injure every single person. I mean, there's maybe some things you could design of shoes to make them injure every single person, but most of what's out in the market is not going and intended to do that.
Totally agree.
Yeah. And then great. I'm going to bring this up, unless I want to take this different direction, which you totally got me with before we started talking, before this episode, is going, what are you going to do with the fact that literally everything, as you mentioned earlier, is also on its way to becoming super? So we have, and again, AFT or super shoes really is an umbrella term. And now we have these things called super trainers that have plates and these foams in them that are also designed at a variety of training speeds. And these have been a great tool that I've suggested for more the slower recreational going. You may not need the fastest shoe out there. You know, there's a lot of shoes that are going to match you and your skill level. And that's not being degraded. That's going, where are you? What's the tool that's going to help you go best? Then you also have more traditional training shoes that don't have stiffening agents, that still may be stiff, that are also now integrating these components. And you have another group that we were talking about that actually use different levels of super shoes for different things, where they might use, as you told me beforehand, and my mouth dropped, but I know lots of people that do something quite similar. An example, use the Saucony Endorphin Pro to do all their training miles and workouts miles in, and then they use the Saucony Endorphin Elite to race in. So technically, they're in a super racing shoe all the time, and that's where the industry is going. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So first, on the delineation there, I think, and you brought this up, the idea of differentiating between a super shoe and a super trainer, there's probably quite a bit of overlap there. And certainly they'll fall into different categories in terms of price, potentially in terms of foam choice, stability or lack thereof, the specific choice of the stiffening agent, the durability, and also kind of how they're intended to be used. So I think maybe more than anything, what differentiates between what we would call a super trainer and what we would call a super shoe or a super racer is really how the person uses the product, maybe more so than any of those other categories, although they're all important. So if you have someone who runs a long run and 2 workouts a week in the Endorphin Pro, but then runs a race in the Endorphin Elite, then is the Endorphin Pro not a super trainer? I don't know the answer to that, but how you kind of the super trainer category is very broad. Even within our own lineup, there are a lot of different shoes that one might consider a super trainer, with different stiffening agents, different types, different foam choices. So it becomes a difficult a category or a difficult topic, but all of them in some way or another end up getting used very frequently for sometimes daily training runs, for workouts, for tempos, for long runs, and sometimes even for races. So the whole idea of what is a super trainer versus what is a super shoe, I think the lines are getting blurred a little bit there. Just to throw the comment out, but yeah, I think my opinion on that is that's great. If it works for you in your life, in your context, and it fits in your training, and it's an environment that is right for your foot and your running and your speeds and your cadence and your leg length and all that stuff, then great. If we'll make it, if you want it, we'll make the best one we can. So awesome. Like it's a category I think will continue to grow. 15 years from now, are most people running in something that's super? Potentially. I mean, even right now, our ride has an ATPU foam. And it's a $140, $150 price point, and people can run in that every day. So I think something that we always try to do at Saucony is we try to trickle down these technologies so they can, we say is democratize innovation. So we introduce innovation and then we try to trickle it down so it can be used for potentially all athletes.
So do you mind if I summarize this really quick?
Please do.
So what I think where the conclusion we're coming from is shoes don't necessarily cause injuries. It's really the most consistent theme that we see from the evidence and from experience is that overtraining causes them, that the body is surprisingly adaptable. There may be some subgroups of people where there's a certain shoe that's really going to emphasize a variable for that person where that just may not be the best tool for them. And that may increase their risk of an injury, but doesn't necessarily mean it's causing it. At the end of the day, you have to overstress and go beyond where you can recover for that to become a true injury, right? And so again, some people may not know how to do that, or the amount of training they need to back off may not be reasonable for that person. So they may need to have a different tool. But super shoes at the end of the day are designed to improve running economy, improve efficiency, to improve performance. And there's now a variety of them. And in fact, the super components have now bled into daily training footwear. Even shoes that we would go, this is a daily training shoe, has these components. And that's how things have always gone throughout the development of footwear. That's how it's always happened. So it's going to progress forward. I think now there's a little bit less concern because I think at Doctors of Running, at least I was really concerned initially as a lot of these shoes came out, and the contrast between a super racing shoe and trainers was so massive that I was concerned that if you spent too much time in one and then jumped aggressively into the other, be it any direction, a sudden big change is a big risk. And that goes both ways. Now that we're starting to see these technologies bleed more into daily trainers, that may be less of an issue. And especially as people are really going, hey, there's such variety that there's certain people who I'm sure are using super shoes as daily trainers and doing fine. I actually have many patients who they would not be able to run at all if they didn't daily train in super shoes, just because of impairments just because of injuries, be it traumatic, running and non-related, age-related things. Like especially the older athlete has really seen a second like birth of being able to run fast and recover from training. So these are not bad things, they're tools, but they still need to be used intelligently and know that some of the training effects or the normal things that our body would be able to tell us with more simple shoes may be blunted, so that just because you feel good doesn't mean you should overextend. The same training principles apply, be it you actually can't get better unless you recover from the stress that you placed upon your body. That's literally how you get better. If you continue to train without adequate rest, you are going to increase your injury risk no matter what shoe you have on, be it super or non. And you're also not going to get better because that super compensation, i.e. the things that makes us better, happens during recovery, not during the training stimulus itself. So these tools are not bad. Different people are going to respond differently. Some people are going to do very well. Some people are not. And that's going to be up to the individual to figure that out. But they themselves are probably not causing injuries across the spectrum of runners. In fact, they're probably not influencing them that much anyway, because the injury rate hasn't actually changed, but injury types have shifted, which is what always happens. Minimalist forefoot stuff, injury rates didn't change. They just shifted where they happened, right? Instead of getting knee, hip stuff, it just went straight into the foot and ankle metatarsal injuries, right, calf, Achilles tendinopathy. Right. Now that we've gone to the more maximalist and super stuff, now it's moving its way back up into a lot more knee and hip related stuff with the occasional foot and ankle thing, right? You're just shifting them, but it still comes down to making sure, especially if you're new to running, get used to the stress of running. It is a stressful thing. It's an awesome thing. It's really efficient to be able to just go out the door, but there's a high injury risk. You need to make sure you let your body adapt and take things slow, even if you feel good, because we know there's plenty of metrics, not to scare you, that would suggest that even if you feel good, if you just did something hard, you need to recover.
It's a beautiful summary.
Sweet. Anything else you would add?
Nope, that covered it.
That's great.
Thanks for having me.
Dude, Cory, thank you so much as always. It is always really fun. That was really good. And I hope some of the listeners and viewers also had some biases challenged. This is why we love doing this. And Cory's just one of those brilliant people who we love constantly bothering and going, hey, what does he think? Because we're all just trying to learn. Okay. We're just trying to share good information and learn ourselves.
Me too.
And yeah, you feel better. It's funny that no matter who you talk to, like the smartest people are always going to say the same thing. So we're in the same boat. So Cory, thank you as always very, very much. Remind me the name of your Substack again, or at least remind our audience so that they can find this.
It's The Inverse Dynamic, or you can just search my name, coryhoffman.substack.com.
So we'll put a link for that in the notes, and then you can find us as always in a variety of different areas, be it this on the variety of different Spotify and iTunes and all kind of places. The YouTube will always be available on Wednesday, where you can see the video. Wednesdays and Sundays is when the podcast and the videos will come out. You can find us there on a variety of channels. All of our other content can be found on our website, Doctors of Running. I want to give a shout out that we've got some awesome people working on a search engine where you can now find and search the different shoes by reviewer, by type, by all kinds of stuff after many requests. Finally happened. And a big shout out to Dan, who's been nice enough to join us, who is a brilliant person who helped us set this up. So if you can, go take a look at that and give us some feedback, because we were testing this, because we're trying to make it easier to help educate everybody, because that's what we do at Doctors of Running. Our goal, and you can find us on the website, Instagram, variety of places, is really not to sell you stuff, but help educate you on the stuff that you're putting on your feet, so you can make better decisions and hopefully train smarter and not have to worry about this stuff as much and just go out there and run. Cory, thank you very much. And as always, thank you all for coming on, and thank you everybody for listening. We hope this helps, and we'll see you next time.